Okay, hello, this is Daniel Land Sr., and this is a personal analysis taking place here showing my system as a whole and how I function as a person. So what I want to show is that in our readings, we learned that there's a difference between analytics and synthesis. And whereas this may look like a flow chart or a hierarchy, that's not what's taking place here. This is actually a systemic whole, and it functions as a whole with systems and subsystems throughout, with environmental influences and inputs with feedback, whether it's negative or positive, as stipulated at the headings of our environmental influences. You'll also notice that in this, there's four main subsystems of the system as a whole, which is dealing with our psychological, our physical, our emotional, our personal portrait, our astrological summation, our matrix, goes towards, goes away from, and then we have our 20 environmental influences. Now, we learned through the concepts of synthesis and system thinking that any type of change in the system will affect the system as a whole. So we're not here to break down the system into reductionism to where we can pick a particular system or a particular problem or a particular influence, whether it's negative or positive, and come to some resolve or conclusion about that one portion of the system. What we understand about the concept of system thinking is that regardless of what that influence is, the system is going to change in some way. What I'm showing with my environmental influence is that, for example, if education impacts my matrix and then has feedback coming from my matrix, that doesn't mean that that direct input or influence on my matrix didn't have any effect on the rest of my system as a whole. So if you look at my core subsystems, you will see that there are bidirectional communications taking place between those subsystems. So regardless of what the changes are, how big or small or negative or positive, there's some kind of change that's going to take place somewhere in that particular system that may affect that system as a whole. So that's pretty much the concept of system thinking, that it changes as a whole, not as one variable in that whole. So we're pointing that out with our 20 environmental influences. So whereas I showed that education directly had influence on the matrix, I also showed other inputs and influences with my index card from each influence or environmental influence to show where that particular influence may directly come into the system, but don't necessarily mean that because it gives a feedback from that same subsystem that it didn't have an impact somewhere else in the system. So I pretty much pointed that out with each 20 different environmental influences. I also left one at the bottom. If you look to the bottom right, that last page where it says additional environmental influences, that is an opening, so our system is not functioning as a closed loop. So the environment can change in addition to the 20 environmental influences that we have, and also impact how that system changes as a whole. So that's pretty much how the subsystems and systems of the personal analysis works, is that we're showing some of these inputs from all different perspectives, and whether they direct or indirect, whether they positive or negative, they will have some impact on our system. So it may appear like a hierarchy or something like that, or complex, but I see now that I'm looking at my system, it's pretty simple as far as how some of my past and present variables or impacts or inputs impact my system and how I function as a person based on system thinking. So that's pretty much how this system is pointing out how my emotions or my physical can be affected. Like, I think I use work to show that work can come in through my matrix, but it can have a psychological effect, or it can have an emotional effect, as well as a physical effect on me as a system and how I function as a system. So even though it came in directly through the matrix, through me moving towards a particular goal or away from a particular goal, whether that goal or that situation might have been poverty, or I may be moving towards a more materialistic lifestyle, it had some kind of impact, physical or emotional, that may have negative or positive feedback on other parts of the system, which changes the system as a whole. So it is not just one part of the system that's impacted. So that's pretty much how I could break this system down for a personal analysis and see how all of the subsystems and systems function as one whole system, which pretty much explains the things about me as I wrote them down in my system analysis. Hey, thank you for listening. I'm Daniel Land Sr.